Vermont, the state known for its ski resorts, ice cream, and socialist politicians. Vermont today is perhaps the most left-wing state in the most left-wing region in the country. However, for 108 years straight, only Republicans were elected to governors of Vermont. With only one exception in 1964, Vermont voted Republican in every presidential election from 1864 to 1988. Since the dawning of the 21st century, Vermont has radically changed its political landscape from being a solidly Republican state to a solidly Democratic one. What we're going to unpack here today is why and how that happened. It has become fashionable today to believe that the two national parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, switched their entire intellectual foundations overnight in one fell swoop. This isn't true at all. In reality, the default tradition of New England voters was conservative, not liberal. Vermont voters have always had an independent streak, and therefore sought to distance themselves intentionally from national political issues that were shaping America in the middle of the 20th century. Some social scientists place emphasis on demographic changes in the state. However, when one looks at the numbers, this was only marginal. The real reason why the Vermont Republican Party fell apart was because it became a victim of its own success. The party's leadership became embittered and utterly demoralized, while at the same time the Democrats were able to exploit those divisions. Changes in the legislature and how legislatures were elected and the dividing up of districts was another crucial factor. This not only became important in Vermont's transition to the political left, but for the rest of the New England states as well. Today we're going to ask the question, what the hell happened to those Vermont Republicans? So to begin, Vermont, which means Green Mountain in French, was created on January 15, 1777 by representatives of the New Hampshire Grants. They hammered out a constitution that included the abolition of slavery, which would be the first in the nation. On March 4, 1791, Vermont was admitted into the Union after a 17-year-long run as an independent nation. It would become the land of the 14th star. While the Federalist Party did have some presence, Vermont was dominated by the Democratic-Republican Party. After the War of 1812, the Democratic Republicans became the de facto single party of the United States. For a time, the old divisions had dissolved and partisanship was less frequent. Beginning in the 1830s, Vermont stopped voting Democratic in fear of bringing about a return to partisan politics. At the same time, New England politics took a more moralistic turn. Vermont became a haven for the abolitionist movement earlier than most other states. Vermont even became a resting stop for runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad before they would make the trek into Canada. The state also became home to the growing anti-Masonic movement, and members of the anti-Masonic Party were even elected to governor at one point. By the time the Republican Party formed in 1854, there was already a very moralistic and Calvinistic political culture that permeated throughout Vermont and most of New England. In Vermont, the Republican Party dominated in all statewide races. From 1854 to 1958, only Republicans were elected to the State House of Representatives. Presidential elections tell a similar story. From 1858 to 1988, with only one exception, Vermont voted Republican every single time. Even during the height of the New Deal era, did Vermont only vote Republican. The governor's races are particularly fascinating. For 108 years straight, only Republicans were elected as governor. Vermont's political system for a long time was more or less fixed by the Republicans. Vermont is roughly cut in half by a mountain range separating the western and eastern portions of the state. Western Vermont is historically more liberal, as it has many New York transplants who have moved into the state. The eastern side of the state, meanwhile, is more conservative and is populated by people who originally came from New Hampshire or Massachusetts. In order to prevent their party from fracturing along regional lines, Republicans in the state came with an informal rule of nominating and electing public officials in this state. This was called the Mountain Rule, and it was an informal rule of nominating candidates for public office. Nominations would be on a rotation where only Western candidates would be selected as governor for 1 2-year term, and following that term, an Eastern candidate would be selected. The rule was beneficial for Republican politicians since it meant that one could lose the nomination fight at the party's convention, but still would be safe in the knowledge that they could run again 2 years later. The Mountain Rule also served the purpose of keeping the party unified, but over time it became a means of assuring there would be a new governor every 2 years. It was also beneficial for the party since it meant that up-and-coming politicians wouldn't have to run against incumbents. While the Republican Party of Vermont was hegemonic, it still had factions. There was a more conservative faction led by the Proctor family and a more liberal faction. First cracks in the system came as early as the 1928 gubernatorial election. That year, John E. Weeks was elected to the then unprecedented second 2-year term. While this arrangement kept the party happy for now, it did not make for good government, as governors who could only serve 1 term lacked the incentive to best serve the state. The Mountain Rule not only applied to governors, but also to the legislature as well. Of all the House speakers elected since 1870, none served more than 4 years, and most only served 1. Another reason that the Mountain Rule collapsed was that in 1830, Vermont lost 1 congressional seat. The previous districts loosely followed this rule, and with the 2 districts replaced with just 1, it now meant that there was less room for ambitious politicians to rise in the system. This inevitably led to competition and conflict and divisions within the party. This came to a head in 1958, where the Republican Party primaries were held and where 6 candidates fought for the nomination. At the end of the day, Harold Arthur won. However, the party was bitter and divided. The result was that Democrat William H. Mayer became the first Democrat to win a national seat in Vermont's history. The first big breakthrough for the Democrats came in the 1952 gubernatorial election. That year, Republican Lee E. Emerson won in a 3-way race against Democrat Robert W. Larrow and write-in candidate Henry D. Vail. Emerson did end up winning with 51.9% of the vote. However, Larrow secured 39.8%, and Vail won 8.3% of the vote. This was a close race considering how Republicans had been so dominant in gubernatorial elections up until this point. A decade later, in 1962, Democrats won decisively when Philip Hoff won the gubernatorial election in 1962. Hoff's victory is credited to the fact that he ran up the numbers significantly in the eastern part of the state, especially in Burlington. The issue of demographics is one of the most significant reasons often brought up by social scientists to describe why Vermont shifted to the left. James L. Sundquist of the Brookings Institute in 1973 suggested that the New Deal and the rise of the coalition made possible from it made a liberal Vermont a possibility. He looked at states like Iowa and North Dakota and saw there was a huge wave of Democratic support in the years following the Second World War. This wasn't the case in Vermont, where the small towns that dominate the state still by and large voted Republican. Only Burlington, the largest city in the state, was at least somewhat favorable to Democrats. Scholars of social and political science have long pointed to the industrialization and modernity as the cause for liberalization across the country. This is certainly true in the case of most states, and is somewhat true in Vermont. From 1939 to 1960, Democrats grew in the towns proportional to the size of the towns, so especially in Rutland and in Burlington. From 1961 to 1976, however, what had happened was that the relationship between the size of the town and party dominance decreased, but Democrats had more equilibrium across the state. This meant that the small towns began to bring more affluent and therefore meant more progressively minded voters into the communities. As a result, Democrats became more viable in the area. There has been plenty of speculation about the sociological factors that caused Vermont to turn to the left. What researchers have found was that this was somewhat limited. What we also found was that the rise of national television in Vermont made Republicans less favorable to Democrats. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, the first Democratic presidential candidate to win in Vermont in the landslide 1964 election, became the first Democrat since the Civil War to win in Vermont. And he utilized the power of television to help secure his victory, especially with the people in the towns. Same thing ran true for Vermont's first Democratic governor in a century, Philip Hoff, who was very charismatic and used television to his advantage. Nonetheless, it's clear that social changes did not play the most important role from the transition of Vermont from a conservative state to a liberal state. Rather, it was a series of changes at the top of the head of the Republican hierarchy that made it possible for Democrats to have an even playing field to be competitive in the state. Republicans today are still active in Vermont. Interestingly, Republican Governor Phil Scott is one of America's most popular governors, even though he works in a democratically controlled House and Senate. It seems pretty clear that the Democrats will dominate the once Republican state for many years to come. However, it should be fair to realize that the reason why states like Vermont in the Northeast in general voted from Republican to Democrat wasn't because there was a one fell swoop in party ideology and in party voting. Rather, it was a slow process that involved changes within the regional parties and in voting attitudes and in sociological factors.